Hi, I'm Dixie, and on this channel I share my historical costuming projects, and if you have ever seen any of my previous videos, you know that I have struggled with using a janky adjustable Dritz dress form to help me fit my projects. Well, I finally decided to upgrade to something different, but I really wanted a form that more closely matched my actual body shape. The best option would be to buy one of those 3D scan forms where they make an exact replica of your torso, but those things are very expensive. Stitchers on a budget usually have a few options for dress forms, including these types of adjustable dress forms, which run about $150, which is what I bought, and I completely regret it. This thing is a piece of garbage. Plasticky, useless garbage, and I hate it, and I really want to take it out into a field and give it the printer treatment from Office Space. The main selling feature of this type of form is that it is adjustable, but you soon realize that the adjustability is necessary because the felt-covered plastic segments are so rigid that you have to turn all of the gears to the smallest setting in order to stretch a garment over the top of the form and then crank it back out to fit. The resulting gaps are annoying to work around, and while you can technically pin into it, you can only pin sideways. The rigidity is the worst in the bust area, which in no way matches my own shape. Even if I added extra padding, I can't move the bulk of this point up or down. Oh, and if you add padding, that technically negates the adjustability feature. At least one of the gears in here is busted, so I have to push or pull the segments apart. None of the clamps along the length of the stand will hold because they're all made of cheap plastic. This thing is supposed to help you measure the hems, but it won't stay in place either because, again, plastic. This ruler on the side is just a sticker, so of course it has peeled off and left a nasty residue. But honestly, this sticky stuff does more to help hold up the form than any of the clamps. And the legs have lost their rubber covers, so I have to tape them to keep the raw metal from scratching my floor. Another budget-friendly option is the Bootstrap dress form, which is a printable pattern that you use to sew up a dress form that is made to your measurements, mostly. But I want to be upfront that this is not going to be a tutorial on how to make it, because there are already some great videos on that, which I will link to below. But I do want to talk about my experience buying and making and using my new form. So I went on the Bootstrap website and chose the Missy Fit DIY stuffed dress form body replica made to measure sewing pattern. Say that 5 times fast. And the first thing I noticed on the measurements list was that it did not account for 1/2 inches in height. So from there on out, I decided to go with centimeters so I could be more exact about my measurements. I was also concerned that they didn't ask for high hip, only low hip, and they didn't measure between the waist and hip levels. So like, what if you have a really high prominent hip bone? They did, however, have a second tab for fit adjustments that added a few more measurements, and I would highly recommend you take advantage of that. And then we got to these weird general categories that don't rely on objective numbers and are more like, just tell us what you look like. Okay. So I had to guess the size of my butt, and I'm no Kardashian, but am I Taylor Swift level of flat? I think I chose flat over very flat. Then there's belly protuberance, which most of us have some level of this, but since I don't typically see other people without pants, I can't really compare. So it's kind of hard to guess where I would fall on this range. I also don't want to be idealizing my figure. I want it to be accurate, so I think I picked D. And then comes posture, and this was where I really struggled to choose. I know that I have a sway back, but I also know that I have rounded shoulders, but I could only pick one. Finally, we have seam allowance and file output, and I'm actually very glad that they offered these options, as you will see later. I chose an Adobe Illustrator file with no seam allowances included so that I could make some adjustments since I was still skeptical about the fit. When you download the files, they come with a poor quality 3D rendering of your torso based on your input, and yeah, my tummy does not look like that. I don't know what's happening here. Like, why does it curve up? That's just odd. So I brought the file into Illustrator to tweak it, and it looks like this extra volume is only at the vertical seam lines that run through the bust points and not at the center front seam. So I had to reduce the curve on 2 pattern pieces. But if I just took the volume out of there, that would have made my overall hip line too small. So then I had to add space back into the side seams. You could also do these kinds of adjustments on paper too after you printed out the pattern. Once I was satisfied, I moved my pieces over to a new document to put them in a more economical layout for printing and added 1/2-inch seam allowances. For fabric, I used a cotton canvas, which is pretty thick and not stretchy, which is important because I chose to forego the interfacing layer. If you want to use a fancy, pretty outer layer of fabric, you absolutely need interfacing and or some kind of stabilizer. Unfortunately, the fabric store only had barely 2 yards of this natural color, so I had to supplement some parts that weren't going to be seen, like the interior cover of the base and the armholes with muslin. Also, I pre-washed the canvas just in case I ever needed to wash the form, and it was a beast to iron flat. In fact, I even got some rust stains on the front pieces of the form from trying to steam it, which I guess adds to the industrial vibe of the utilitarian materials. The outer shell came together really quickly. Just make sure that all your notches are matching up. That's important. The instructions recommend using a short stitch length, like 2 millimeters or less, which is definitely necessary as these seams will be under a lot of outward pressure. I've heard some other people say that the bust area was the trickiest part to sew, but for me that was relatively easy. If you've ever sewn anything like really small, like a bra or even kids' clothes, like that's not going to be too hard. The part that I had the more trouble with was like the caps at the neck and the armholes. I actually basted those in place by hand so I could match my seam lines up and then sewed them by machine. I had a hard time finding a single sponge that was thick enough to fit in the neck hole, so instead I stole these 2 car wash sponges from the garage and stacked them together. And I didn't have an X-Acto knife to cut these, so I just trimmed them down the best I could with scissors. You really can't tell that the edges aren't smooth once they're under the outer fabric layer. Sewing the interior support doesn't seem like it makes any sense at first, but just follow the instructions and make sure all your notches are matching. You basically have to turn the entire body right side out and carefully sew together some seam allowances. The interior plastic tube was one thing that I had trouble finding online in the precise measurements that I needed. The important thing is just to note that the inside of the tube has to be big enough to fit around your stand, and when you sew the fabric that surrounds your tube, you have to go by the exterior measurement of the tube. Again, double check your measurements. The pattern called for a 5-pound bag of stuffing for my size, and I used probably less than 1/4 of that, which just goes to show how well stuffed that fiber fill is inside of the bag. One thing I've learned from stuffing toys is that to avoid lumps, you should quickly fluff out your fistfuls of stuffing from the original bag before you insert it into the project. If you just grab from the bag and force it into the dress form, it just keeps whatever lumpy shape it was originally in, and it doesn't conform well to its new space. You also want to alternate stuffing between each side because the interior tube can easily start shifting left or right, which would make your dress form lean over, assuming you can even find the tube once it's lost inside the body. I struggled with stuffing the shoulder area and the bust points. The instructions do remind you to add extra stuffing to the bust. I also overstuffed the waist the first time around, which seems to be a common issue. It's really hard to adjust the stuffing in the top of the form once you're further down, and I started realizing pretty early on that the stuffing would need some rearranging. But I wanted to see how it would settle over time, so instead of gluing down these fabric tails on the end of the interior tube to the cardboard base like the instructions said, I taped them down so that they could be removed later. After a couple weeks, I took out most of the stuffing to fix the shoulders and bust, and now the measurements are more accurate, although the fabric is a little bit wrinkled. So how does the form fit? And how does it compare to my old adjustable dress form? And what's it like to use? Well, one, it is easy to pin into, although the neck sponge is denser than the fiber fill in the body. And we knew that this isn't going to be an exact replica of my body, because it isn't a scan, but I think the result is pretty good. There are a couple fiddly things with the fit. Although Bootstrap can take into account the measurement of the back neck to the bust apex and bust apex to apex. I think the underbust line is a little low, and I think I've seen a few other reviewers say something similar. My fix for the front tummy area worked for the most part. I think there's still some roundness, but it's not as extreme. The stand I'm using is cast iron, and I got it as a Christmas present, so it was free for me. I wanted a really heavy stand, hopefully to prevent the form from tipping over because I have a toddler running around. This one doesn't come with any kind of clamp, which is one thing I really needed with my old form, so I'm actually just using a guitar capo because it's what I have around. But you can always just go buy a real clamp at a hardware store. You can see the shape of my new form compared to the old one. The shoulders are much more sloped and more narrow. The bust is less pointy. Hip shape is more accurate, and obviously I don't have these big gaps at the seams. And most importantly, my new form is squishy. And this form is on wheels, so I can easily move it around, and the base takes up much less space. So how much did this thing cost? The canvas fabric was about $15, and I used muslin scraps for the extra fabric. Zippers were about $5. The sponges were free, but you could buy one for less than $5. The cardboard came with the fiberfill box, which that was about $30. Again, you very likely do not need nearly that much, even if you are doing a plus size form. The plastic tube was about $17. The stand was free for me, but you can find a wood or a metal version online from anywhere between $20 to $100. If you bought less stuffing and a cheaper stand, you could definitely do this for about $100. For me, not counting the stuff I got for free, it was about $70. With the stand and other stuff, it would be about $150. To compare, my old dress form was also about $150 from a big box fabric store, and I would much prefer working with the Bootstrap form. I've already been using it on a few projects, and I think it's working out pretty well. I'm gonna make a playlist of other video reviews for this form that I'll link below. If you have made this, please let me know in the comments. I wanna know what your experience has been. Do you like it? Do you think it's better than the other alternative dress forms that you can make, like a duct tape dress form or just padding out a standard dress form? Thank you for watching. I'll be back in a couple weeks with more historical sewing adventures. Bye.